Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name's Travis Jeffries with the Boise City Department of Arts and History. It's nice to see you all. Welcome to the Fettuccine Forum. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people here in the Boise Valley. I'm just going to go through a couple of housekeeping items. I'll promise to keep it brief before we get to the main event and our speaker tonight. Just a reminder, this is a hybrid event. It's being recorded. We're broadcasting online. So if you do have questions, we'll do a moderated Q&A at the end, but you'll notice those of you in person, you have papers and pencil in front of you, and any point throughout the presentation, feel free to write down a question, hold them up. I'm joined here tonight by my colleague, Caitlin Hocklander. Caitlin will come around. We can collect your questions. No need to wait until the end. Anytime you have a question, feel free to write it down and hold it up, and we will do our best to get to as many of your questions at the end as we can. And of course, if you're joining via Zoom, you just use that Q&A feature to pose questions, and we'll do our best to get to the Q&A, the questions that come in via Zoom as well. Also, if you're joining on Zoom, we have auto-generated captions. You can view those by clicking on the live transcript button and then show subtitles. So once again, just hit live transcript and then show subtitles. If you're in the audience and you're hard of hearing, let us know. We have some listening enhancement devices that we can get you set up with. So a little bit of background about the Fettuccine Forum. It's been a fixture on Boise's cultural landscape, as many of you know, for a really long time, going on 20 years now, so we're excited to be bringing you the 19th Forum season. The Forum is made possible with support from the Office of the Mayor, Boise State Public Radio, Boise State History Department. Thank you, Bob, and all of you, of course. So if you like programming like the Forum, please consider a donation to the History Division's Heritage Fund. It really does help out. Or you can contribute at Boise Arts and History Foundation at boiseartsandhistoryfoundation.org. One thing, I'll point out that Meriwether Cider is here offering beverages for those of you 21 and older. So want to thank them for attending. They've been great partners all year long. So thank you very much, and encourage you all to support local business. So a little bit about the theme, right? You might notice that we have a theme for this year's Fettuccine Forum. It's a 4-part series, and we're exploring histories and stories that maybe are overshadowed, overlooked, perhaps even purposely erased from historical memory. So, you know, those stories and those histories have always existed, right? But they might not have had the pride of place as some of the more dominant histories. So at the City of Boise and within the Department of Arts and History, we're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we seek to tell stories or to facilitate the telling of stories from many different perspectives. And that's why we've organized this year's Fettuccine Forum around the theme of From the Margins to the Center of History in Idaho and the West. And through that theme, we really hope to amplify those stories that, again, have sort of always been there, right, but which maybe haven't received the traction to this point that they deserve. So there's 4 installments in this year's forum, tonight being the 4th and final. So you may be last, Dr. Bennett Shelton, but you're certainly not least. On October 6th, we had the good fortune of hearing from Professor William White III of Cal Berkeley. What did archaeology at the Irma Hayman House tell Boise, Idaho? On November 3rd, we were treated to History, Healing, and Restoration, featuring Mr. Darren Perry of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. On March 2nd, we had Out in Idaho, Queer Spaces Beyond Boise, featuring Professor Lisa McLean and MA student Rachel Taylor, both of BSU. And tonight, of course, we have Traditional Chinese Medicine in Idaho and the American West, A History of Herbs and Roots, featuring Professor Tamara Bennett Shelton of Claremont McKenna College. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our guest tonight. Tamara Bennett Shelton is a professor of history at Claremont McKenna College and author of 2 books, Squatters' Republic, Land and the Politics of Monopoly in California, 1850 to 1900, was published as part of the Western History Series, a joint venture between the University of California Press and the Huntington Library. And she is author of the award-winning Herbs and Roots, A History of Chinese Doctors and the American Medical Marketplace, published by Yale University Press. She has a BA from Amherst College and an MA and a PhD from Stanford University. In addition to her scholarly publications, her writing also appears in textbooks, scholarly journals, blogs, and newspapers, including the Washington Post, LA Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I'm now pleased to turn our time over to her. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Travis, and thanks everyone for coming out. Just give me a second here. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight in Boise with all of you. I'm going to lower this so it's not poking me in the eye. I'm really quite delighted to be here to talk about the history of traditional Chinese medicine in Idaho and the western United States. I'm going to see how this works. Let's see. It does not work. Did it?
Clicker's not working.
Clicker's not working. Well, have an idea?
Bear with us, folks. Technical difficulty.
I'll do it that way. All right. Okay, we'll go one further. So for many Americans, when we think of traditional Chinese medicine, we think of this. Go ahead, Travis. Oh, no problem. Acupuncture and the nationwide frenzy for it in the 1970s. But of course, as maybe many of you know, acupuncture is just one of many traditional Chinese therapies, and its discovery, or I would say its rediscovery by the American public in the 1970s, is in fact the end point of my book and not its beginning. So Chinese medicine has a very long history in the United States, dating back to the colonial period and extending up to the present. Long before there was mass migration from China to the United States, Chinese materia medica crossed the oceans in both directions. And in the 1850s, as the first waves of Chinese immigrants began coming to America, doctors were among them. Let's see if my clicker's going to work now. There we go. Did I make that happen, or did you? You did. Oh, I did. Excellent. I have the magic. Okay. Now, there were a range of healing practices in China, a wide range of healing practices in China. But up until the 1970s, immigrant doctors who came here tended to come from this sort of middling class of merchant physician who learned diagnosis by pulse or pulsology. So if you've ever been to the Chinese doctor and they felt your pulse to sort of figure out what's going on with your systems, that's the kind of diagnosis they were doing. And they were also practicing herbalism, which they had learned in family businesses. So back home in China, they would have specialized in a proprietary remedy, but abroad, they became general practitioners. They treated and diagnosed and treated all manner of ailments. They set bones, and sometimes they delivered babies and provided abortions. Over time, in the American medical marketplace, Chinese doctors became associated with practitioners of what we would now think of as complementary and alternative medicine. Now, Chinese medicine has a long history here in Boise, too, and I'll start this story at its end as well. In 1971, a wrecking ball leveled 8 blocks of squat wooden buildings in downtown Boise, and with them, much of its Chinatown. This window, pictured here, recovered from the rubble, reads Gerald H. Ah Fong, Chinese Remedies and Herbs. And you might recognize it from the Idaho State Historical Museum, where it was part of an exhibit honoring Gerald's grandfather, C.K. Ah Fong. From 1892, Ah Fong and then his sons and his grandson diagnosed illnesses and compounded herbs in 2 locations, one on Idaho Street and the other on 7th. C.K. Ah Fong was not the only Chinese physician in the area. In his time, the U.S. Census identified 8 living in the vicinity of Boise, but he was the most famous and he was the most successful. Ah Fong had immigrated to the United States in 1867. He came with his father, who was also an herbalist, and they initially set up shop in San Francisco. But competition there was pretty steep, and so Ah Fong came up northeast to serve the medical needs of Chinese miners in the boom towns of Rocky Bar and Atlanta, and later in Boise's Chinatown. And he served not only Chinese patients, but non-Chinese patients as well in a thriving wholesale and mail order business. He served people through the mail all the way throughout the Rocky Mountain West, all the way to Mexico, actually. So people would write in their symptoms, and he would compound something and mail it to them. Now, my book, Herbs and Roots, tells the history of people like C.K. Ah Fong. It chronicles roughly 200 years of the history of Chinese medicine in the United States. It's a history of transplantations and transformations, but it's also a history of American medicine, its professionalization and its regulation, and a history of Chinese immigrant families. Before I go on, I want to say a little bit about how I came to this project now over a decade ago. At the time, I was teaching in Portland, Oregon. And just about everyone in Oregon, as Bob probably knows, because Bob came from Oregon too, everyone in Oregon becomes familiar with this guy, Dr. Ing He. From 1888 to 1948, Ing He sold traditional Chinese remedies at a shop called Kamwa Chung, located way out east in the town of John Day. When Ing He was too elderly, when he was too infirm to run the business, his nephew, who's also an herbalist, came out and moved him to a nursing home in Portland. And the nephew put a key in the lock of Kamwa Chung, turned it, and left everything in place. Some years later, in the 1970s, the state took over the property, and when they opened the door, it was sort of like Tutankhamun's tomb. They found a treasure trove of items, very dusty, but a treasure trove nonetheless. Things like tins, jars, and boxes of remedies, also company records, personal papers, personal letters, and other effects, and so forth. Today, Kamwa Chung is a state heritage site. It's an archive and a museum, and Ing He has been the subject of an award-winning documentary that aired on Oregon Public Broadcasting. Now, I became aware of Ing He while living in Oregon, and as any good history nerd and social historian as I am would do, I began to wonder about other people like him. How many Chinese doctors practiced in the United States? Where were they? What did they do? More broadly, I wanted to understand how their experiences could tell us something about their time and place. And I thought, I'm going to find maybe 2 or 3 of these guys and it'll be enough to publish an article. But it turns out that Chinese doctors were everywhere. Everywhere there were Chinese people, there were Chinese doctors. They were in every state of the Union. They were in Canada and Mexico, but unsurprisingly, they were more numerous in places where Chinese immigrants concentrated, especially in California and the West. After 1850, in any given year, there were probably around 200 practitioners of Chinese medicine working in the United States, but they assumed an outsized importance in their community. They were, of course, healthcare providers and educators. They trained their children and extended families in traditional practices, but not all the work they did was strictly medical. Chinese apothecaries were recreational and religious centers. They were post offices. A Chinese herbalist might act as a banker or a translator, certainly as a labor broker and a grocer sometimes. They sponsored new arrivals. They extended charity where possible. And when Chinese exclusion barred the entry of working class Chinese, some Chinese doctors participated in forgery and smuggling networks that allowed their countrymen to circumvent immigration restrictions. Now, the earliest example I found of a Chinese doctor advertising his services in the United States is this, and I highlighted the date, which hopefully you can see, even though it's sort of small. In April of 1799, this advertisement ran in a Harrisburg, Pennsylvania newspaper. A man identifying himself as Chinese doctor, Dr. John Howard, announced that he was seeing patients at his home on 2nd Street. Howard claimed he had come from Canton, and he promised to treat a range of ailments with herbs and roots that he had imported from China. His advertisements ran in the Harrisburg newspaper throughout the spring and early summer of 1799, and then he moved to nearby Carlisle and advertised in its paper through the fall of 1800. So John Howard, I believe, was the first practitioner of Chinese medicine in the United States, and certainly the first one to advertise his services in English. But who was he? Was he even, in fact, Chinese? Chinese men and women did travel. They did travel abroad, and often at great distances prior to 1800. They went to Europe, they went to India, they went to other parts of Asia, as well as Mexico and Hawaii, but relatively few went to the United States or the British colonies that would then become the United States. Their presence there went entirely unrecorded until the 1810s, when a few religious students and domestic servants started to appear in the written records. So John Howard, if he was in fact Chinese, would have preceded those men's arrival by more than a decade. John Howard might have well been an American pseudonym that he adopted because it was more easily pronounced and remembered by his English-speaking clientele. Chinese doctors did that quite a bit. But to be honest, I know very little about him. I can say very little about him. He might not have been Chinese. He could have spent significant time in China, either as a foreign merchant or a missionary. He does not appear in the 1800 census for either Harrisburg or Carlisle, nor in other public records, aside from a few scattered references here and there in newspapers and a medical journal. But the thing that I did think was interesting, or that I was able to tell when I found references to his business, for example, in a Connecticut newspaper, which announced the opening of his shop in 1800, what I thought was interesting was that this announcement really made no mention of his nativity. It talked about the diseases and afflictions that he cured. It praised his abilities. It called him a descendant of Galen and Hippocrates. But the fact that he may have been Chinese, maybe the only Chinese person living in sort of central southern Pennsylvania at that time, was really not remarkable. The newspaper made no mention of it. So what I take from that is this, that the idea that someone in South Central Pennsylvania would be practicing Chinese medicine was just not that surprising. Because by 1800, 50 years before mass immigration from China to the United States began, Americans were already, to varying degrees, familiar with Chinese medicine. Americans in the colonial period and early republic descended from a European world with a long-standing curiosity for all things Chinese, including traditional Chinese medicine. In early America, among the educated elite, there was a great appetite for information about China, its philosophy, history, also its medical practices, and that information flowed freely across the oceans. Formally trained American physicians had very strong ties to their colleagues in Europe. Many of them had actually trained as doctors in Europe. And American medical libraries collected European studies of Chinese herbalism, also acupuncture and moxibustion, which is the burning of medicinal plants on or very close to the skin. In 1825, Benjamin Franklin Bakke, a physician and indeed the grandson of that famous Philadelphian, the one you're thinking about, Benjamin Franklin, experimented with acupuncture on prisoners, and he was not alone. He reported in the North American Medical and Surgical Journal that several American physicians had successfully employed acupuncture when treating inflammatory diseases, headaches, and other chronic pain conditions. So nearly 200 years ago, we have an example of American physicians embracing what we might now think of as integrative medicine. Ordinary Americans were most likely to encounter Chinese medicine through its drugs. So Chinese materia medica traveled both to and from American shores. By the end of the 1700s, Americans from Georgia up across Appalachia all the way to what's now Minnesota had become major producers and exporters of ginseng. Between 1783 and 1900, approximately 60 million pounds of wild-growing ginseng was shipped to Asia from the United States. Chinese medicinal plants were imported to the British colonies of North America and then to the United States via England, and they were either stocked in local apothecaries or sold by itinerant drug peddlers. So along with things like tea and rhubarb, medicinal herbs like cassia and camphor, which were not exclusively grown in China, were often identified with the country in American pharmacy catalogs. In early America, every family had a book of domestic remedies, many of which contained mention of more esoteric Chinese medicines, which I have pictured up here. If I had a laser, I could point it out. But one of them is Oriental bezoar, which is also sometimes called Chinese snake stones, believed to be an antidote for poison. And then, and I thought this was kind of fun when I found it, in the early 19th century, reports of a remarkable plant began to circulate from the mid-Atlantic to New England. The plant was described as a dirty yellow root, which took the form of a vegetable in the summer and a worm in the winter. I don't know if anyone has a guess as to what this is. I gave this talk to a room full of practitioners of Chinese medicine, and they knew what it was. But maybe, I don't know if I have any like plant biologists out there. Apparently, this is a plant that's very interesting to plant biologists. It's called Cordyceps sinensis, and it is a very weird plant. Go Google it; it will make you question whether free will actually exists. So it's a combination of a fungus and a caterpillar. It's native to Tibet, and today you sometimes see it referred to as Himalayan Viagra. Now, when mass immigration from China began in the 1850s, the immigrants' need for healthcare was acute. Chinese laborers were relegated to the least desirable and most treacherous jobs. In remote work sites, Chinese laborers were often at the mercy of labor brokers and employers to provide basic necessities. In cities, poverty and discrimination confined them to overcrowded and unsanitary living quarters, the perfect breeding ground for infectious diseases. And inter- and intra-racial violence was pervasive. Chinese immigrants were routinely denied treatment by American hospitals or were segregated in special buildings designated for people afflicted with smallpox or leprosy. And public health officials unfairly cited American Chinatowns as sites of contagion and pathologized Chinese bodies as disease vectors. So when Chinese doctors came with other immigrants from their country, they provided essential services. They provided services at a moment when mainstream medical care was not an option. As I began to locate Chinese doctors in the historical record, I became interested in the way that their stories intersected with the history of American medicine more broadly. So I'm going to just take a step back and talk about what's going on in American medicine. Now, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a really critical time for the history of medicine in the United States. In this era, a new science of disease transmission based on the germ theory was becoming popular with formally trained European and American physicians. And beginning in about the 1890s, the American Medical Association, the AMA, partnered with state and local governments to standardize medical education and licensing. Its aim was to monopolize the medical marketplace and drive unlicensed doctors, including Chinese herbalists, out of business. So we get new licensing exams that concentrated on medical science and pharmacology that had been approved by AMA physicians, and new laws that imposed fines and jail sentences on doctors practicing without a license. And this is the moment that Chinese doctors chose to become increasingly active in the American medical marketplace. It might not seem like the best idea, right? This might not seem like the best time to get involved in the American healthcare business. And indeed, anti-Chinese racism did prevent nearly all of them from sitting for licensing exams or otherwise securing the legal right to practice. So for the most part, they practiced without a license, and as a result, they faced prosecution, they paid fines, and they spent time in jail. The exception to that was Boise's own C.K. Ah Fong. Now, Idaho's first medical licensing statute in 1887 required two things. It required one of two things. It said that you either had to present a medical college diploma, or you had to prove that you had been practicing medicine in Idaho prior to the passage of this law. So C.K. Ah Fong had both, and he did both. He presented a diploma from a Cantonese medical college, and he had proof that he had been working in Idaho as a doctor for about 12 years at that point. But in 1899, the Idaho State
legislature revised its licensing statute to exclude foreign residents ineligible for citizenship, which is to say Chinese residents. So when Ah Fong went to renew his license, he was denied and ordered to stop practicing. In response, he went to court. He charged the State Board of Health with discrimination, and he took his complaint all the way to the state Supreme Court, where he won. And he became, on February 21st, 1901, a fully licensed physician and surgeon in the state of Idaho. He was one of just a very few licensed Chinese doctors in the entire United States. So licensed and mostly unlicensed, from the 1850s onward, Chinese doctors regularly cared for non-Chinese patients. They advertised their services in English and Spanish and in Chinese language newspapers that circulated in the United States. And it can be, I think, difficult to square the American consumption of Chinese remedies with prevalent anti-Chinese racism. Throughout the 19th century, Americans embraced and spread stereotypes of Asians as backwards, barbarous, even effeminate, and these perceptions often justified exclusionary and discriminatory policies that targeted Asian nations and immigrants. And such racist thinking did extend to the realm of Chinese medicine. If Chinese people were backwards and primitive, then so must be their medical knowledge. So we see attacks on Chinese doctors in English language media frequently ridiculing their therapies as out of touch, as backwards, as unscientific, unmodern. Yet scientific medicine's monopoly on the medical marketplace was really far from complete, and Chinese herb businesses flourished in spaces where regular doctors had not yet consolidated their control. So I want to talk a little bit here about how, for American patients skeptical of modern biomedical science, criticism of Chinese medicine could, in fact, constitute its allure. Now, there are a number of reasons why Chinese medicine appealed to such a broad spectrum of patients in this period. First, Chinese medicine undoubtedly benefited from the fact that American patients were open to it. They were open to diversity and experimentation. I like to say that people sampled quite freely from the kind of global buffet of medical options. In such a landscape, Chinese medicine was no more or less bizarre than proprietary remedies, faith healing, electroshock therapy, chiropractic adjustments, and homeopathy. Chinese medicine also tended to be non-invasive. And that mattered because at this time, surgery was still pretty much more likely to kill you than not. And then finally, herbal remedies were common across all cultures. So Chinese herbal medicine may have seemed, at least at first glance, familiar, like the domestic remedies to which Americans were already accustomed. Now, to understand the success of Chinese medicine in the American medical marketplace, we can look at how and to whom Chinese herbalists advertise. So I want to talk first about the ways that they advertise to women. Whoop, there we go. So this is an ad for a Los Angeles-based herbalist. Chinese physicians really seem to have been particularly adept at recruiting female patients. By 1880, Chinese doctors were regularly advertising their expertise in gynecological disorders in English language advertisements like this one. And also, these are my favorites, if the clicker will let me show you. It's decided to stop. These are my favorites. It didn't want me to show them to you because they're too amazing. These are business cards from the 1910s advertising Eastern Oregon's Kamwachang. And as you see, or as I would argue, they aim to sell not only medicinal herbs, groceries, Chinese goods, and general merchandise, but also a kind of vision of modern femininity. Each card portrays a white woman sort of beautifully dressed and adorned. Let me see if it'll advance to the next one. No, still no. This woman is ice skating. I think I didn't put up the one. I have another one of a woman golfing. They're pretty fabulous. And I'm just going to hazard a guess that these are not, in fact, images of the Eastern Oregon ranching and farm wives who patronized Kam Wha-Chung, not to be mean about it, but perhaps they were representations of what they aspired to be. Can you go forward one more? This is an actual picture of one of Maud Truesdale, who was Inghe's patient. So I'm not just making it up. So the popular press often attacked Chinese doctors and portrayed female patients as overly susceptible to Oriental quackery. But the press really did not acknowledge the ways in which modern medical science failed to meet the needs of female patients. At the turn of the 20th century, American women had good reason to distrust regular medicine. Elite, formally trained doctors were often dismissive of women's health concerns. Gynecology was, at the time, a strictly surgical specialty. And as I mentioned before, right, surgery came with a lot of risk as well as pain. So at this time, and long before, really, American women turned to irregular or alternative medicine. Irregular doctors, including Chinese herbalists, often defended women from physically and psychologically damaging procedures used by their regular counterparts. Chinese doctors explicitly denounced gynecological surgeries in their advertising. Can you go forward one, Travis? Thanks. So in 1869, a San Francisco medical journal reported that this fellow, Li Po Tai, recommended that a woman shave her head and blister it, which I think is a reference to moxibustion, the burning of plants against the skin, to remedy a prolapsed uterus. And so you're thinking to yourself, that doesn't sound like something that would work. I agree. That recommendation may not have seemed particularly pleasant either, but it was probably preferable to a hysterectomy that biomedical surgeons typically prescribed for the same. For Euro-American women apprehensive about the prospect of physical intimacy with the male Chinese physician, some offices and clinics promised the presence of white female assistants and receptionists who were also native speakers of English or sometimes Spanish. And women who sought care from male Chinese physicians could also be assured of very limited physical contact. There we go. Thanks. So here's this picture again, a different advertisement from the same company. You could see he's performing pulsology on her, so he only has to touch her with 3 fingertips. And I don't have examples, but other doctors would use a doll. They would bring a doll in and say, where does it hurt, or where do you feel your discomfort? And I think this is apocryphal because I just can't believe this is actually true. They would set up a curtain and tie a string around the woman's wrist, and then the doctor would feel for the vibrations in the string, like that game of telephone that you used to play as a kid. So at any rate, all of this is to say that a non-Chinese female clientele would have understood that they would have very minimal physical contact with their doctor. The promise of non-invasive procedures may have encouraged white women to seek out Chinese doctors for childbirth and abortion services as well. The philosophy of Chinese medicine toward pregnancy was fairly pragmatic and inclined to privilege the health of the mother, which distinguished it from American medical science at the time. American medical science seeming designed to discourage women from making choices about their reproductive life. Go for it. All right, so the other thing I wanted to share with you is the way in which Chinese doctors advertising in English language media also deployed a language of natural medicine to sell their services to non-Chinese patients. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American accounts described Chinese medicine as nature's remedies and Chinese doctors as uniquely attuned to nature. So just to say a little bit here about this idea of natural medicine, this is a kind of discourse, it's a kind of set of terms and images that first took shape in the early 19th century, in the moment when municipalities began to regulate the practice of medicine for the first time. And those regulations were really pretty feeble. They were really poorly enforced, but nonetheless, they started to kind of draw this circle around sort of some some medical practices as legitimate, some medical practitioners as having authority, and some not. So outside of the circle were practitioners who were deemed irregular, and these were usually self-taught or informally trained healers, healers whose ranks very often included women and people of color, and they tended to use, not all of them, but they tended to use less invasive procedures, and they tended to prescribe animal or plant-based compounds rather than mineral-based drugs. So in the early 19th century, these kinds of common practices and principles allowed irregular doctors to claim a special authority over and connection with nature. And this is nature as described as something kind of essential and universal. And that term, nature's cures, kind of persisted throughout the 19th century into the early 20th century. So it persisted through a moment when Americans were increasingly anxious about modernity, when there was sort of a heightened anxiety about large-scale mass industrialization and the ways in which modern life seemed severed from the natural world. So modernization and modern medicine more specifically was in some ways somewhat disturbing and frightening to people who tended to think of nature as a place of physical and maybe even moral regeneration. Now, Chinese doctors practicing in the United States at the turn of the 20th century freely borrowed from this discourse of natural medicine to promote their services to non-Chinese patients. And it was easy for them to do so, not only because their therapies did favor non-invasive procedures and plant and animal-based remedies, but also because American patients were already conditioned to perceive Chinese civilization and medicine as backwards, as ancient, as the opposite of modern, and therefore potentially closer to an unmodernized natural world. I won't even try. So, okay, I know this is a bad reproduction, but I'll explain what it is. The earliest newspaper advertisements for Chinese medicine were just a few lines. They were usually just the doctor's name, his office location, maybe his specialties. But in the 1880s, some enterprising physicians and herb companies began to include images like this one. Most commonly, it would be just a picture of the practitioner wearing an easily identifiable Oriental costume. But this one does something in addition to that. So this is an ad from 1882. The reason why it looks so terrible on your screen is because it is tiny, itty bitty tiny, and I do not have the Photoshop abilities to increase its resolution. So this is an advertisement for a LA-based doctor, Los Angeles-based doctor, Hui Kung. So you see it has a simple line drawing of a man in traditional Chinese jacket and trousers, and he's holding a flower. So in an economy of images, the illustration conveyed not only the racial identity of the doctor, but also his expertise in botanical medicine. Appeals to nature's remedies just became a tactic, and one important tactic in the Chinese doctor's advertising arsenal. You start to see in the 1880s Chinese doctors frequently promoting the image of Chinese medicine based on pure and growing things, as opposed to minerals, chemicals, poisons, drugs, things that they associated with Western-style medicine. And that association does go all the way back to 1799 when John Howard was selling Chinese herbs and roots out of his rented room in Pennsylvania. Can you go forward? But it also resurfaced in 1877 when Dr. Ah Fo promised no poisonous medicines to his Oakland, California clientele. References to nature became even more prevalent in English language advertisements for Chinese medicine after 1890, as states increasingly mandated these public exams and licensure for healthcare providers. Can you go one forward? Between 1890 and 1894, Chang Ji-wo, who was first based in Omaha, Nebraska, and then moved to Portland, Oregon. That is him, the disembodied floating head above his shop in Portland. Ran ads in various newspapers touting his wonderful, marvelous, miraculous cures, which were, in fact, nature's remedies tested for thousands of years in China. A reputation for dispensing nature's remedies became a way for unlicensed Chinese physicians to distinguish themselves and to attract patients who were distrustful of state-sanctioned modern medical science. Can you go forward one more, Travis? In its turn of the 20th century advertising, Los Angeles' Fu and Wing Herb Company asserted that herbal remedies were, quote, founded upon a complete understanding of nature's laws. Americans carry their theories of science to extremes and get too far away from the simple, fundamental facts upon which health depends. So Chinese doctors seem to have been quite successful in their campaign to associate their health practices with natural medicine. Although very few of them ever secured a medical license from the state, they attracted a non-Chinese clientele that defended their right to dispense nature's remedies in public testimony and in popular and academic publications. But selling Chinese medicine as natural medicine did not come naturally to its practitioners. Non-Chinese patients may have interpreted nature's remedies as a translation of an exotic or ancient Chinese natural philosophy, but I argue that it was more likely an adoption of an American medical vernacular. The meanings of nature and traditional Chinese medicine were not directly translatable into Euro-American categories. Traditional Chinese medicine, as a kind of compilation of many doctrines and practices, did not conceive of nature as the opposite of science or the opposite of modernity, nor were herbs more natural than minerals by virtue of being organic instead of inorganic. So, could you go forward one more? I was interested, and one forward again. Those are just some guys in San Francisco. So I was really interested in kind of trying to see if this discourse of natural medicine featured in the Chinese language advertisements. So advertisements that Chinese herbalists working in the United States distributed to be seen by other Chinese immigrants in the United States. So these are from newspapers that circulated in the United States. They're printed in San Francisco and spread throughout. So with some help, I looked at a sample of about 75 advertisements from the late 19th to early 20th centuries, and I found no references to any terms that might be linked to what we think of as natural medicine. And I have a kind of list of terms that I can tell you more about if you're interested. But instead, what these advertisements tended to do, and I just have a couple examples here, is they tended to emphasize the expertise and skill of the practitioner, his or her reputation for curing diseases where other doctors had failed, and sometimes his or her training in Western medical colleges and hospitals. Now today, Chinese medicine continues to be more closely associated with nature in the American popular imagination. That coupling of Chinese herbal remedies and nature has become, I think, so commonplace that American consumers hardly question it. So you can go forward, Travis. So I have, I don't know if this is a brand that is familiar to you, but this is a kind of popular brand of capsulized Chinese herbal medicine. So you can see here are some examples, these pill bottles that have pictures of bamboo, flowers, a field of grass. Occasionally you get a label that shows a male or female figure, usually costumed in robes and caps from pre-modern China, very often framed in tree branches, a mountainous vista, or other images that convey this sort of embeddedness in nature. And let me tell you, the images on the outside of the bottle really have nothing to do with what's inside the bottle. So just FYI. Critics of what we now think of today as biomedical science continue to characterize conventional pharmaceuticals as toxic or unnatural. And then Chinese herbal remedies, on the other hand, are presumed to be unsynthesized or closer to their original state as plants, animals, or minerals, and thus safer to consume. So that close association between Chinese medicine and nature has been a major source of its practitioners' legitimacy and power, and that seems to me unlikely to change. Yet there are numerous dangers to human and non-human health that stem from such presumptions. Go forward. So that supposed closeness to nature has not led to sustainable relationships with the material environment or the species from which traditional remedies are sourced. We see that with the overforaging of wild ginseng in North America and the poaching of wild animals like tigers, bears, rhinos, pangolins, etc. Today, a lot of nonprofit organizations are non-governmental organizations like Animals Asia and the Environmental Investigation Agency are fighting really what is like a kind of multi-pronged war on wildlife crime. We also need to know a lot more than we currently do about the side effects of using traditional Chinese remedies, particularly in conjunction with other medicines. There can be quite serious adverse health outcomes, such as bleeding, kidney and liver damage, even depression. Forward. So my book ends with a history that is still very much unfolding. It's really quite valiant efforts among Chinese and Chinese American scientists from the 1970s to today to fill in these kinds of knowledge gaps. And I think there's a lot of hope that this work might eventually mitigate some of those dangers, especially the dangers to human health, maybe most acutely, and open up more possibilities for Chinese therapies to be covered under insurance and make Chinese medicine, once again, more accessible to American patients. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bennett-Shelton. Really appreciate it. A super insightful, thought-provoking presentation. Want to thank you for coming to Boise, right? Making the trek. First time in Boise is my understanding.
First time in Boise.
Yeah. So
not my first time in Idaho, but my first time here.
So before I want to launch into Q&A and just to give some time for questions, additional questions to circulate, filter up. I'll just make a brief announcement because I think it's apropos of your wonderful presentation and the work that you're doing. So the Arts and History Department is currently embarking on an oral history project. Thank you very much. Seeking to document the history of Chinese Americans in Boise. So we've already conducted some interviews, maybe folks with whom you're familiar, Dr. Bennett-Shelton. But if any of you are familiar with anybody, if you might be interested or know somebody who's interested in sharing their story relative to Chinese and Chinese Americans in Boise, maybe the descendants of the very folks that Dr. Bennett-Shelton has been talking about and sharing with us today, please let us know. We have business cards right outside the door. Just grab one on your way out. Feel free to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. So we have some audience questions. An additional one, a couple more. Caitlin, if you wouldn't mind circulating around and grabbing those, or I can come get them from you. Thanks, Mackenzie. So I noticed some questions about CK Fong. I had a question about CK Fong as well, so maybe we could start there. This comes from the audience. Do you have an idea of where the descendants of CK Fong reside? If so, do they still practice TCM? That's traditional Chinese medicine. Thank you. And how?
The only thing I know is that Gerald, who is the grandson of CK Fong, he had already left Boise and moved to California by 1971 when the shop was demolished. So I don't actually know. I think the Boise line of Fongs probably ended with him, but I really don't know. Do you know? You have a hand up.
In the Boise school system,
There you go.
California, and the daughter is still alive named Martha.
Is she in California too? Yeah.
Incidentally, my dad was a Chinese cook doctor in Boise from 1934 to 1973.
Who was your dad? What?
Mm-hmm. His office was right here on 6th Main Street.
Well, this was Chinatown, right?
That's right.
Until 1971.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, that's amazing. And we'll have to follow up with some of you folks. So fantastic. Yeah. Thanks for being here tonight. Really appreciate it. Great question. This is actually something I was interested in because I tuned in on Idaho Matters. Great job, by the way. Have you encountered any records of Chinese doctors interacting or sharing practices with indigenous wisdom and the teaching of plants?
So that's a really good question and something that I have personally, I have seen very little evidence of, but people who do, there's a lot of historical archaeology work right now happening in Chinese work sites, especially in Southern Oregon, in California, Nevada, and they have been really adept at uncovering things in basically like middens, like the place where people were dumping their food waste and other kinds of waste. So I know they have found some reasons to believe that Chinese workers were purchasing medicines from indigenous healers. And certainly it would be consistent with what I've seen in terms of Chinese immigrants' general kind of openness to experimentation and improvisation. So when I started working on this project, when I was in Oregon, I was working with the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine with practitioners there. And they said to me, you will not find any kind of native grown plants or animals being used by Chinese herbalists in the United States. They imported everything from China because of the specificity with which Chinese medicines have to be grown, harvested, procured. So, it has to be grown in a certain place. It has to be harvested at a certain time of year, sometimes under a certain type of moon. And so they said, you're not going to find anything. And then I did. I mean, Chinese doctors, one, they couldn't actually get everything that they needed from China. But two, I mean, they were living in a world that was rich and alive with different medical traditions. So they were very much experimenting with everything that they came in contact with. They were substituting things like rattlesnake for types of snakes they would have had in China. They were using bobcat bones instead of tiger bones, and also growing their own, things like ginkgo and what is it called? Stinking nightshade and things like that. So I think even though the evidence is pretty scant that there were interacting with indigenous healers and trading and exchanging for medicine, I think it must have been happening more than we have evidence for.
Fantastic. Thank you. This is a great comment. They say, not a question, a diagnosis doll is on display in the Humboldt County Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada. So
Cool.
Thank you for that. So if I may interject with a question, right? So as I mentioned, I was listening to your interview, and I think this might come up in your book as well. You mentioned that C.K. Yafong, his clientele was primarily non-Chinese, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is a time in Idaho in the late 1800s, right, where we're seeing obviously the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and an uptick in violence and expulsions across California, across the West, even in Idaho. Mm-hmm. But you also mentioned that there are folks experimenting with traditional Chinese medicine with TCM, right? Mm-hmm. So at the same time, and I was struck by that tension. Yeah. Can you unpack that a little bit or speak to that tension and what was going through people's minds that this process of discriminatory violence was taking place at the same time where Chinese materia medica is infiltrating the American medical marketplace?
Yeah, it is kind of one of those puzzles, right? We have maybe an idea that in the era of exclusion, there was a great gulf that existed between Chinese and non-Chinese people in the United States, that they no longer had contact, or that anti-Chinese racism was so deeply seated and prevalent that non-Chinese people living in America wouldn't deign to interact with Chinese. It's just simply not the case. People continued to go to Chinese restaurants. They continued to employ Chinese servants and cooks in their households. The Chinese were deeply involved in an intimate economy, caring for the bodies of non-Chinese people everywhere. So yes, there was violence, and yes, there was racism. Certainly exclusion was a real thing. But I think it's sort of this human quality to hold two things to be true at one time, that they could see Chinese medicine as being something salubrious and helpful to their lives, and yet also want to exclude Chinese, deny entry and deny rights of citizenship. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is the way that Chinese doctors respond to exclusion, because they do have to kind of actively cultivate an image for themselves that is apart from, let's say, certain kinds of negative Chinese stereotypes. So they do have to kind of assert that their practices are hygienic and sanitary, right? That they're not, that they themselves are not disease vectors or, sort of sites, that their offices are not sites of a contagion. You start to see after about 1890 more of them moving out of Chinatowns, so spreading out across the city. Yep. One of the people that I interviewed for this book, who is the daughter of an herbalist, actually he practiced in Twin Falls, Idaho, this herbalist. He would very deliberately, they were kind of not quite itinerant, but he moved something like 25 times in 18 years. He liked to be on the go all the time. And he took this family, he had something like 9 children in the end. So he would kind of pack them all up. And the first thing they would do is they would try to find the white part of town, and he would rent a house. And in the front, he would see patients. And in the back, his wife would be compounding the herbs, and all the kids would be helping out. And so he quite deliberately never lived in Chinatowns. And I think it's part of this desire to distance the practice from the site that was being pathologized.
Right. Yeah, well, thank you. A wonderful question coming in via Zoom here, and I hope she won't mind my identifying her by name, but Peilin Yu, who has been instrumental to helping us along with this oral history project. She says, wonderful talk. Thank you. I'm very glad to hear the Afong family recognized for their important contributions. Do you have information on traditional Chinese medicine practitioners working among the gold miners of Idaho City, the Boise Basin? P.S. Please visit the Chinese gold mining exhibition at the Museum of Mining and Geology right here in Boise. Fantastic exhibition. I would absolutely recommend that.
I do have a little bit more in the book that I didn't talk about mining towns in Idaho. I think there's probably a lot more that could be done, but I'll just I'm just going to have to say, go look in the index of the book. It is in there. There's some really neat stories about the ways in which Chinese doctors working in these kind of remote mining outposts, who and principally were there to help Chinese miners, the way they got the attention of non-Chinese miners, usually through kind of extraordinary acts of healing. So I think I have an episode in the book where an influenza epidemic strikes a mining town and in Idaho, and this Chinese doctor blows a sort of magical dust in everyone's nose and heals them. And so these white miners were really intrigued by that and began paying him for, I'm actually not even really sure what he was using, but whatever kind of probably like ground up plant that he was using seemed to work.
Yeah, and so it's not the Boise Basin, but you mentioned in your book that C.K. Afong, he emigrated from China to Rocky Bar, right?
Yeah, Rocky
and
Bar,
to
Atlanta. Yeah,
which is not in the Boise Basin technically, but it's pretty close. It was in the southern fields, the southern Boise Mountain gold fields. So yeah. In your research, did you find any records of Chinese women practicing traditional Chinese medicine? You touched on that a little bit, but could you expand on that?
Yeah, I did. And this is also something where when I started this research, I wasn't expecting to find that. And it's not obvious. So I kind of went into it not expecting to find a lot of women practicing medicine, mostly because of sort of cultural prohibitions on women having these public-facing roles. And then I was working with someone on an oral history, and actually the woman I mentioned, Anna Dawn, from who now lives in Tucson, and her dad had been up here in Twin Falls. And she said, well, my mom was the pharmacist, right? My dad would talk to the patients, but my mom actually compounded the medicines in the back. And all of a sudden I kind of thought, oh my gosh, I have to look for the women in the back. And so then when I went back to my other records, the women are there, they're not the person whose face appears on the advertisement, but if you look in business records and census records, there are always women, and I'm sure they were like Anna's mom in the back doing the pharmacy work. And then occasionally I have examples of women who would take the public role, and this is more from a later period, so more like 1920s, 30s. And it was usually in a situation where the husband or the patriarch, whoever had been the public facing business person had died or was otherwise kind of compromised and couldn't work. So very often I have examples of the women who had been working in the back stepping up and taking over. And certainly Chinese women were involved in midwifery and other things like that. They're usually not identified as doctors in the census. That was the other thing I had to learn, was how to find them, identified principally as cooks. So yeah, they were definitely there.
Yeah, you sometimes have to read between the lines, right, and make some assumptions there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all the questions. Thank you all so much for your participation. I mean, this is a great number of questions here, both in person and via Zoom, but maybe one more? Okay. This individual writes, where did they procure their herbs and medicine from? Via ships, but from port to Idaho, what vehicle did they use? Maybe wagons? Did they develop any domestic sources? I'm guessing for the medicines, for herbs.
Yeah, so principally they did import medicines. So there were wholesalers who operated in southern China and Hong Kong and would send dried medicines, so medicines that were treated in China and for long distance shipment. They would send it to San Francisco, and then San Francisco had a number of wholesalers who would then distribute it kind of across the United States through, I mean, all the systems of transportation you can imagine, by train, by wagon, by ship, where possible. Chinese doctors also traded a lot with one another. So I have letters they'll write to each other and say, I'm out of this. Do you have any? And they would mail it to one another. And then they grew some things that they could grow. Around the 20th century, you start to see more commercial farms starting to develop. And when I say farms, I think these are small farms, but commercial farms that are specializing in producing traditional Chinese remedies, and then they would sell it too. Was that the entirety of the question? I mean, they also did substitutions. As I understand it from another person I interviewed who was, he didn't want me, I'm not going to name him because he actually told me to take this out of the book, but when he came to the United States to go to college, and his dad was an herbalist and would mail him herbs from China, and he would sell them to Chinese herbalists at a time when it was actually illegal to send Chinese herbs through the mail, so he was a smuggler. So he's a very nice guy, and he let me use other parts of his story, but that one he was like, don't mention that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing with us. Yeah. And his anonymity will be protected here. So you got all of it. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Bennett Shelton. It's been a pleasure. I hope you all enjoyed. Totally. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here throughout the course of this season. Thank you for being here tonight. Be sure to join us in September when the Fettuccine Forum will return for the 2023-2024 season. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening.